Hello everyone, I am Mr. Disturbing, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know what happened in the Monongahela National Forest in May 2025. What I experienced over those 4 days changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness, about what lives in the forgotten places of these mountains. My name is Logan Price, and I'm probably the only person who can tell you the truth about what happened to my friends Derek Nguyen and Jamal Rivers beneath Raven Rock. 3 months have passed since I stumbled out of those woods, and I still wake up screaming. The doctors say it's PTSD, that my mind is processing trauma in the only way it knows how. But they don't understand. They weren't there when the forest itself turned against us. They didn't see what I saw in the depths of that cave system. They didn't hear the sounds that still echo in my nightmares. Derek, Jamal, and I had been best friends since our freshman year at West Virginia University. We'd bonded over our shared love of the outdoors and our mutual frustration with the sanitized hiking content flooding YouTube. Every trail guide seemed to focus on the same overcrowded destinations, the same scenic overlooks that had been photographed a million times. We wanted to show people the real Appalachian wilderness, the places where cell towers couldn't reach, and where the forest floor hadn't been worn smooth by thousands of hiking boots. That's how Backcountry Honest was born. Our YouTube channel had been growing steadily for 2 years, earning us nearly 50,000 subscribers who appreciated our raw, unfiltered approach to wilderness exploration. We didn't sugarcoat the dangers or gloss over the physical demands. We showed the mosquito swarms, the sudden weather changes, the moments when you realize you're completely alone in thousands of acres of untamed forest. Derek was our technical expert, a 27-year-old computer science graduate who could jury-rig solar chargers and waterproof our equipment with military precision. He had an analytical mind that approached every problem methodically, breaking down complex situations into manageable components. But he also had a quiet intensity that made him the perfect person to have at your back when things got difficult. Jamal was our storyteller, a 28-year-old journalism major who had a gift for capturing the human element of our adventures. He could make viewers feel like they were hiking alongside us, sharing our struggles and triumphs. His easy laugh and natural charisma made him the face of our channel. But beneath that friendly exterior was a steel determination that had carried us through some genuinely dangerous situations. I was the navigator and wilderness survival specialist. At 26, I'd spent most of my life in the mountains of West Virginia, learning to read weather patterns, identify edible plants, and find water in the driest conditions. My grandfather had taught me the old ways, the skills that had kept mountain families alive for generations. I thought I knew these forests better than anyone. In early May 2025, we received a message from a subscriber named Marcus Chen, a geology student at Marshall University. He'd been studying topographic maps of the Monongahela National Forest and had identified what he believed was a significant cave system near Raven Rock, a remote formation in the Cranberry Wilderness. According to his research, the caves had never been properly surveyed, and the surrounding area had been largely ignored by recreational hikers due to its difficult access and unstable weather patterns. The location was perfect for our purposes. It was remote enough to offer genuine wilderness experience, challenging enough to test our skills, and unexplored enough to provide our subscribers with truly original content. We began planning immediately, studying satellite imagery, weather forecasts, and historical accounts of the area. The Cranberry Wilderness is one of the most pristine and isolated sections of the Monongahela National Forest. It covers nearly 36,000 acres of rugged mountain terrain, with elevations ranging from 2,400 to over 4,600 feet. The area is known for its unpredictable weather, sudden temperature drops, and thick fog that can reduce visibility to mere feet. It's also home to black bears, wild boar, and according to local folklore, things that are better left undisturbed. We scheduled our expedition for May 15th through 19th, planning to document our exploration of the cave system and the surrounding area. The weather forecast showed a high-pressure system moving through the region, promising clear skies and moderate temperatures. What the meteorologists didn't predict was the sudden atmospheric disturbance that would trap us in the wilderness with something that defied every natural law I thought I understood. The drive to the trailhead took us through winding mountain roads that climbed steadily through small communities that seemed frozen in time. We passed weathered barns, abandoned coal mines, and houses that looked like they'd been carved from the mountainside itself. The further we drove from civilization, the more oppressive the landscape became. Dense forests pressed in on both sides of the road, broken only by the occasional glimpse of distant ridges shrouded in morning mist. We reached the parking area at dawn on May 15th. It was little more than a gravel turnout beside a rusted gate that blocked vehicle access to an old logging road. The Forest Service sign was so faded that the warnings about bear activity and wilderness permits were barely legible. We were the only vehicle in the lot, which wasn't surprising given the location's remoteness. The first few miles of our hike followed the abandoned logging road through second-growth forest. Derek tested his equipment while Jamal provided commentary for our cameras, explaining our route and objectives. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost jovial. We were doing what we loved, exploring territory that few people would ever see. As we gained elevation, the forest began to change. The mixed hardwoods gave way to dense stands of hemlock and pine, and the understory became thick with mountain laurel and rhododendron. The air grew cooler and more humid, carrying scents of moss and decay that spoke of a forest ecosystem that had been undisturbed for decades. Around midday, we left the logging road and began following a game trail that wound through increasingly rough terrain. The path was barely visible, marked only by the occasional blaze that had been carved into a tree trunk years earlier. We were entering true wilderness now, the kind of place where a single wrong turn could leave you lost for days. The first sign that something was wrong came when we stopped for lunch beside a small stream. The forest around us was completely silent. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, no insects. In 20 years of hiking these mountains, I'd never experienced such absolute quiet. It was as if the entire ecosystem had simply stopped functioning. Derek noticed it too. He was checking his GPS unit when he looked up with a puzzled expression. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" he asked. Jamal lowered his camera and cocked his head, listening to the oppressive silence that surrounded us. We sat in that eerie quiet for several minutes, each of us unconsciously lowering our voices when we spoke. The absence of sound was so complete that it felt almost physical, like a weight pressing down on us from above. Even the stream seemed to gurgle more quietly than it should have. After lunch, we continued climbing toward Raven Rock. The trail became steeper and more treacherous, forcing us to use our hands to navigate sections of loose rock and exposed roots. The forest grew denser, blocking out most of the afternoon sunlight and creating a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. That's when we found the first tree. It was a massive oak, probably over 100 years old, that had been systematically stripped of its bark in a perfect spiral pattern. The exposed wood was pale and smooth, as if it had been sanded rather than clawed. The spiral extended from the base of the tree all the way to the first major branch, about 20 feet off the ground. Jamal was filming while Derek and I examined the damage more closely. The precision of the work was unsettling. Whatever had done this possessed not just incredible strength, but also a level of intelligence that suggested deliberate artistic intent. The spiral was mathematically perfect, with each curve maintaining exactly the same width and depth. "This doesn't look natural," Derek said, running his fingers along the smooth wood. "It's too precise, too deliberate, like someone used a machine to do this." I knelt to examine the base of the tree more closely. The ground around it was disturbed, but not in a way that suggested animal activity. The soil had been carefully arranged in concentric circles, with small stones placed at regular intervals. It looked almost ceremonial. We found 6 more trees in the next mile, all showing the same spiral bark removal and the same careful ground arrangement. Each tree was larger and more dramatically altered than the last. The final tree in the sequence had been completely hollowed out, its interior carved into a perfect cylinder that extended deep into the heartwood. As we documented these discoveries, the oppressive silence began to feel actively hostile. The forest seemed to be watching us, waiting for something. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see movement in the shadows between the trees. We reached Raven Rock just as the sun began to set. The formation was a massive limestone cliff that rose nearly 200 feet from the forest floor, its surface carved into strange geometric patterns by millennia of water erosion. At the base of the cliff, partially hidden by a tangle of rhododendron, was the entrance to the cave system that had brought us here. The opening was larger than I'd expected, about 8 feet wide and 10 feet high, with smooth walls that suggested the cave had been carved by underground water rather than formed by natural rock collapse. Cool air flowed from the depths, carrying scents of mineral deposits and something else I couldn't identify. We set up our camp about 50 yards from the cave entrance, following standard wilderness protocol by securing our food and establishing a perimeter. The familiar routine of making camp usually relaxed me, but tonight it felt different. Every shadow seemed to conceal a potential threat, and every sound made my heart race. As darkness fell, we built a fire and began preparing our evening meal. The flames provided some comfort, creating a small circle of warmth and light in the vast darkness of the forest. But even with the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. Derek was checking his equipment when he suddenly froze, his head cocked as if listening to something. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first I heard nothing but the crackling of our fire. Then, gradually, I became aware of a sound that seemed to come from deep within the cave system. It was a low, rhythmic humming that felt more like a vibration than an actual sound. The frequency was so deep that I felt it in my chest rather than heard it with my ears. Jamal had started recording, his camera pointed toward the cave entrance. The humming continued for several minutes, gradually growing louder and more complex. It began to separate into distinct tones, creating harmonies that no single creature should have been able to produce. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The forest returned to its unnatural silence, leaving us staring at the cave entrance with growing unease. "We need to go in there tomorrow," Jamal said quietly. "Whatever's making that sound, our subscribers need to see it." Derek nodded slowly, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "We'll need to be careful. This isn't like anything we've encountered before." I agreed, but privately I was beginning to wonder if we should abandon the expedition entirely. Every instinct I'd developed over years of wilderness survival was screaming that we were in danger. But I also knew that backing down now would disappoint our subscribers and damage our reputation as fearless explorers. We took turns keeping watch throughout the night. During my shift, from midnight to 3 a.m., I witnessed something that still haunts my dreams. The humming sound returned, but this time it was accompanied by movement near the cave entrance. At first, I thought it was just shadows cast by our dying fire. But as I watched more carefully, I realized that something was emerging from the cave. It wasn't a creature in any sense that I could understand. It was more like a flowing mass of darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The shape was constantly changing, sometimes appearing solid, sometimes seeming to dissolve into mist. It moved with a fluid grace that suggested intelligence, but its form was so alien that my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The thing circled our campsite slowly, staying just outside the range of our firelight. I could hear it moving through the forest, but the sounds it made were wrong. Instead of the normal rustling of leaves and snapping of twigs, it produced a whisper-soft susurration that sounded almost like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. I woke Derek and Jamal, but by the time they were alert enough to observe, the thing had retreated back into the cave. They believed me when I described what I'd seen, but I could tell they were struggling to accept the implications. Dawn came slowly, filtering through the forest canopy in pale gray shafts. We emerged from our sleeping bags exhausted and on edge, but also driven by a curiosity that overrode our better judgment. Whatever was in that cave system, it was unlike anything that had been documented before. From a scientific perspective, we had a responsibility to investigate. We spent the morning preparing for our cave exploration. Derek checked and rechecked his lighting equipment, making sure we had enough battery power for extended filming in complete darkness. Jamal reviewed our emergency protocols and made sure our backup communication devices were functioning. I studied the topographic maps, trying to understand the geological structure of the area. The cave entrance looked different in daylight. The smooth walls showed signs of recent disturbance, as if something large had been moving through the passage regularly. The air flowing from the depths was cooler now, carrying mineral scents mixed with something organic that made my stomach turn. We entered the cave system at 10 a.m., with Derek leading the way and Jamal documenting our progress. The main passage was larger than I'd expected, with a ceiling that rose beyond the reach of our flashlights. The walls were covered in flowstone formations that created the illusion of frozen waterfalls, and the floor was carpeted with a thick layer of fine sand that showed clear signs of recent disturbance. The humming sound was stronger inside the cave, seeming to come from the walls themselves rather than any specific source. As we moved deeper into the system, the sound grew more complex, separating into harmonics that created an almost musical quality. After about 100 yards, the main passage opened into a vast chamber that defied the geological principles I thought I understood. The space was enormous, easily the size of a cathedral, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into darkness above our heads. But what made the chamber truly unsettling was its artificial appearance. The walls were covered in the same spiral patterns we'd seen on the trees, but here they were carved directly into the limestone with surgical precision. The patterns created an optical illusion that made the walls appear to be moving, shifting and flowing like liquid stone. In the center of the chamber was a perfectly circular pool of water so dark it looked like a hole in the earth itself. As we approached the pool, our lights revealed something that made my blood run cold. The water wasn't water at all. It was a thick, viscous substance that moved with its own internal currents, occasionally forming shapes that resembled faces or reaching hands, before dissolving back into formless darkness. Derek was filming everything, his camera capturing details that our eyes couldn't process in the shifting light. Jamal was providing commentary, but his usual confidence was replaced by a barely controlled fear that made his voice shake. The humming sound was overwhelming now, coming from the pool itself and resonating through the stone walls of the chamber. As we watched, the dark substance began to rise, forming a column that grew taller and more defined with each passing second. That's when I realized we weren't alone in the chamber. The walls were covered with what I'd initially taken for more spiral carvings, but as my eyes adjusted to the strange light, I saw that they were actually nests. Hundreds of them, each one carefully constructed from organic materials that had been woven together with geometric precision. Something moved in one of the nests, and then another. The humming sound grew louder, more urgent, and I realized it was a form of communication. We had wandered into a nursery and we were not welcome. The thing that emerged from the pool was unlike anything I could have imagined. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but its proportions were wrong, as if someone had tried to create a person from memory and gotten the details confused. Its skin was the same dark substance as the pool, constantly flowing and reforming. Where its face should have been was a void that seemed to extend infinitely inward. It spoke to us, but not with words. The communication came as images directly into our minds, showing us scenes of the forest from perspectives we could never have experienced. We saw the cave system from the inside, a vast network of tunnels and chambers that extended for miles beneath the mountains. We saw other humans who had entered these caves over the centuries, and we saw what had happened to them. The entity wasn't malevolent in any human sense. It was simply protecting its territory, its young, its way of existence. But its methods of protection were beyond our comprehension and far beyond our ability to survive. More shapes began emerging from the nests, smaller versions of the central entity but no less terrifying. They moved with fluid grace, surrounding us in a circle that grew tighter with each passing second. The humming sound reached a crescendo that made my bones ache, and I realized we had only moments before they decided we were too great a threat to be allowed to leave. I grabbed Derek and Jamal, shouting for them to run. We fled through the chamber, our lights creating wild shadows that made the carved walls appear to writhe and twist. Behind us, the entities gave chase, their movements producing that same whisper-soft susurration I'd heard during the night. The main passage seemed longer on our way out, stretching endlessly ahead of us, while the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Derek stumbled and fell, his camera skittering across the sandy floor. As he scrambled to retrieve it, something dark and flowing wrapped around his ankle. He screamed, but the sound was wrong, distorted as if it were coming from very far away. The thing that had grabbed him was pulling him back toward the chamber, and I could see his eyes wide with terror as he realized what was happening. Jamal tried to help him, grabbing his arms and pulling against the entity's grip. But the dark substance was stronger than both of us combined, and it was spreading up Derek's leg like liquid shadow. Where it touched him, his skin began to change, taking on the same flowing quality as the entity itself. I made a choice that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I ran. I left my friends behind and fled toward the cave entrance, driven by a survival instinct that overrode every other consideration. Behind me, I heard Jamal scream Derek's name, and then a sound that I can only describe as reality tearing apart. I reached the entrance just as the morning sun was obscured by clouds that had appeared from nowhere. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees, and the air felt thick and oppressive. I turned back toward the cave, but the entrance was gone. Where it had been was solid rock, as if the opening had never existed. I searched frantically for any sign of the cave, any indication that I hadn't imagined the entire experience. But the cliff face was smooth and unbroken, showing no evidence of the passages that had extended deep into the mountain. Even the disturbed ground where we'd camped had been restored to its natural state. I spent the next 2 days wandering through the forest, trying to find my way back to civilization. The silence that had unsettled us earlier was gone, replaced by the normal sounds of a healthy forest ecosystem. Birds sang, insects buzzed, and small animals rustled through the underbrush. It was as if the entire area had returned to normal once the entity had finished with whatever it had been doing. When I finally reached the parking area, I found our rental car exactly where we'd left it. Derek's and Jamal's gear was still in the back, but there was no sign that they'd ever been in the forest with me. When I tried to show the authorities the footage we'd recorded, I discovered that all of our cameras and recording equipment had been wiped clean. The official investigation concluded that Derek Nguyen and Jamal Rivers had never been on the trip at all. According to the evidence, I had gone into the wilderness alone and suffered some form of psychological breakdown that caused me to create elaborate false memories of companions who didn't exist. The fact that I couldn't provide any physical evidence of their presence supported this conclusion. But I know the truth. I know that somewhere beneath Raven Rock, in chambers that exist outside the normal rules of geology and physics, my friends are still alive. They've been changed, transformed into something that can survive in that alien environment. Sometimes, late at night, I can hear them calling to me in harmonies that no human throat could produce. I've tried to return to the area, but I can never find the exact location again. The forest seems to shift and change, hiding the entrance to the cave system from anyone who might disturb the entity's work. The thing beneath Raven Rock is still there, still protecting its territory, still waiting for the next group of explorers who think they understand the wilderness. If you're watching this, if you're one of the subscribers who followed our channel, please understand that there are places in these mountains that should be left alone. The Appalachian wilderness is older than human civilization, and it harbors secrets that our minds aren't equipped to process. Derek and Jamal believed in showing people the truth about the wilderness, even when that truth was uncomfortable or dangerous. I'm honoring their memory by warning you about the things that live in the deepest places, the entities that have been waiting in the darkness since before our ancestors learned to make fire. The forest is beautiful, but it's also alien. It operates by rules that we don't understand, and it's home to things that see us as intruders in their domain. Be careful when you venture into the wild places. Be respectful. And if you ever find yourself in a forest that's too quiet, if you ever see trees that have been marked with spiral patterns, if you ever hear humming that seems to come from the earth itself, turn around and leave immediately. Some discoveries aren't meant to be shared. Some truths are too dangerous to know, and some friends are lost to places that exist outside the boundaries of our reality. The thing beneath Raven Rock is still waiting. It's always waiting. I never thought I'd be sharing this story. Even now, 6 months later, my hands still shake when I think about what happened in those fog-shrouded hollers of eastern Kentucky in November 2025. People ask me why I'm finally speaking out, and the truth is simple. Someone needs to know what's really out there in those mountains. What I experienced over those 18 hours changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness and about what shares it with us. My name is Naomi Turner, and I'm a 29-year-old wildlife photographer from Lexington, Kentucky. I've been documenting Appalachian ecosystems for over 7 years, spending countless nights alone in the backcountry with nothing but my camera gear and survival equipment. I know these mountains like most people know their neighborhood streets. I can read weather patterns, identify animal tracks in complete darkness, and survive for days off the land if necessary. That experience is probably the only reason I'm alive to tell this story. November 15th, 2025, started like any other assignment. My childhood best friend Lena Moore had driven down from Cincinnati to join me for what we'd planned as a 4-day photography expedition in the Daniel Boone National Forest. Lena was a field biologist specializing in Appalachian flora, and she'd been wanting to document the late-season fungal blooms that occur in the region's old-growth forests. We'd collaborated on several projects over the years, combining my photography with her scientific expertise to create compelling nature documentaries. The weather forecast was typical for mid-November in eastern Kentucky. Cool temperatures in the upper 40s during the day, dropping to the low 30s at night, with intermittent fog and a slight chance of rain. The autumn colors had mostly faded, leaving the mountains draped in the somber grays and browns that make the Appalachians feel ancient and haunted even on the brightest days. I picked Lena up at her hotel in Hazard at dawn. She was buzzing with excitement about the rare species she hoped to photograph, particularly a bioluminescent fungi that only appeared in the deepest, dampest parts of the forest during late autumn. We'd spent weeks coordinating our equipment lists, and she'd brought specialized macro lenses and UV lighting equipment that would allow us to capture the ethereal glow of these organisms. The drive to our chosen trailhead took us through winding mountain roads that climbed steadily through small coal mining communities. We stopped for supplies at a weathered general store in a town called Foggy Bottom, population 312 according to the rust-stained sign. The elderly proprietor, a weathered mountain woman with suspicious eyes, noticed our camera equipment and asked about our plans. When I mentioned our intended destination, she paused in her inventory counting, studying us with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, she said something that I've replayed in my mind countless times since. "Y'all might want to stick to the main trails. Been some strange happenings back in them deep hollers lately. Folks seeing things that don't sit right with common sense." I asked her to elaborate, but she just shook her head and muttered something about old mountain ways before returning to her work. At the time, I dismissed her comment as typical Appalachian folklore. Every rural community has its local legends and superstitions, and I'd heard dozens of similar warnings over the years. We reached the trailhead at an abandoned logging camp around 8:30 a.m. The morning was overcast with a thick fog that seemed to cling to the mountainsides like smoke. The parking area was empty except for our rental SUV, which wasn't surprising given the remote location and the approaching winter season. November weekdays in the Daniel Boone tend to be solitary, which was exactly what we needed for our work. Our plan was to hike 12 miles into the forest to reach an area Lena had identified from satellite imagery as potentially rich in the fungi species she was studying. The terrain would be challenging, following old logging roads and game trails through some of the most pristine wilderness left in Kentucky. We'd set up base camp near a mountain stream, then spend 3 days systematically documenting the area before hiking back out. The first few miles were everything we'd hoped for. The trail wound through dense mixed hardwood forest with towering oaks and hickories that had somehow escaped the logging operations of previous decades. The fog created an ethereal atmosphere that was perfect for photography, diffusing the light and creating mysterious shadows that seemed to shift and move with every step. Lena was in her element, stopping frequently to examine moss formations and fungi clusters, taking careful notes and GPS coordinates for each specimen. I followed behind, capturing the interplay of light and shadow, the way the fog transformed familiar forest shapes into something otherworldly and strange. As we gained elevation, the forest began to change. The deciduous trees gave way to mixed hardwood and pine, and the understory became dominated by thick rhododendron and mountain laurel that formed nearly impenetrable thickets on either side of the trail. The fog grew denser, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet in any direction. That's when I first noticed something was wrong. The forest was unnaturally quiet. In 7 years of photographing these mountains, I'd grown accustomed to the constant symphony of bird calls, rustling leaves, and small animal movements. But as we climbed higher, I realized the woods around us were almost completely silent. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter, no insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the fog itself was absorbing sound. The only noise was our own footsteps on the wet leaves and the occasional creak of tree branches overhead. If you've ever been deep in the backcountry alone, you might know the feeling I'm talking about. It's that primitive awareness that something fundamental has shifted in the natural order. Every instinct developed over millions of years of human evolution was screaming that we were in danger, even though I couldn't identify any specific threat. Lena noticed it too. She stopped mid-sentence while describing a particularly interesting bracket fungus and looked around with a puzzled expression. We stood in that oppressive silence for several minutes, both of us unconsciously lowering our voices when we spoke. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the altitude, or the fog, or some natural phenomenon I wasn't familiar with. But something about the silence felt deliberate, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We continued hiking, but the unnatural quiet followed us. Mile after mile, the woods remained eerily still. Even our own movements seemed muffled, as if we were walking through a vast soundproof chamber. The fog grew thicker as we climbed, until we could barely see the trail markers ahead of us. Around 2 p.m., we were roughly 8 miles into our hike when Lena spotted something that made us both stop dead in our tracks. Off to the right side of the trail, maybe 20 feet into the laurel thicket, was a tree that had been stripped of its bark in a pattern I'd never seen before. It wasn't the random damage of a bear or deer. This was systematic, methodical work. Someone or something had peeled away the bark in long, vertical strips, exposing the pale wood underneath. The stripping extended from about 5 feet off the ground up to nearly 15 feet, far higher than any known animal could reach. More disturbing were the marks in the exposed wood, deep gouges that looked almost like claw marks, but too large and too precisely spaced to be from any animal I knew. They formed a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, like some kind of territorial marking or communication. We left the main trail to examine the tree more closely. The ground around it was soft with decomposing leaves, and I could make out what looked like impressions in the forest floor. Large, elongated shapes that didn't match any animal tracks I was familiar with. The clearest print was enormous, easily 3 times the size of my hiking boot. It showed what appeared to be 5 toe-like impressions with deep heel marks, but the proportions were all wrong. Too long, too narrow, with gaps between the toes that suggested fingers rather than animal digits. Most unsettling of all, the tracks appeared to be bipedal, forming a walking pattern similar to human footprints, but with a stride length that would require someone over 10 feet tall to create. I knelt and placed my hand next to one of the clearer prints for scale. My hand looked like a child's in comparison. Lena was growing visibly nervous. She kept glancing over her shoulder and suggesting we should reconsider our route. I was torn between professional curiosity and a growing sense that we were in over our heads. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was evidence of some unknown bear species, or tracks left by someone wearing elaborate costume feet, or natural formations that coincidentally resembled footprints. But the damage to the tree was too extensive and too high off the ground to be a simple prank. And the prints themselves looked disturbingly organic, weathered by rain and time with natural variations in depth and clarity that would be almost impossible to fake. After taking extensive photographs and GPS coordinates, we decided to continue toward our planned campsite. We were still 4 miles away, and the fog was growing thicker as afternoon faded toward evening. Neither of us wanted to be caught setting up camp in complete darkness, especially not after what we'd discovered. The trail became increasingly difficult to follow as we climbed higher. The old logging road we'd been following deteriorated into little more than a game trail, winding through dense thickets and around massive boulders that seemed to appear out of the fog like ancient monuments. The silence that had been troubling us all day began to feel actively hostile. Every shadow seemed to conceal a potential threat, and every sound we made seemed to echo longer than it should. I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, convinced we were being followed, though I never saw anything concrete. Around 4 p.m., as we navigated a particularly narrow section of trail between 2 steep ridges, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a sound like nothing I'd ever encountered in 7 years of wilderness photography. A low modulated vocalization that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the fog ahead of us. It wasn't quite a howl, not quite a call, but something in between. The pitch and tone suggested vocal cords far larger than any human, yet there was an unmistakably intelligent quality to the sound. It rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost like language, like communication rather than random animal noise. Lena grabbed my arm, her camera equipment forgotten. We stood frozen on the trail, listening intently for any follow-up sounds. For several minutes, the forest returned to its oppressive silence. Then we heard it again, this time from a different direction, as if whatever made the sound had moved while we stood listening. The response came from our left, then our right, then from somewhere behind us. Multiple voices, calling and responding in what was clearly some form of communication. These weren't random animal calls. There was a pattern, a complexity that spoke to intelligence far beyond what any known forest animal possessed. That's when I realized we weren't alone in these mountains. Something was out there in the fog, something that had been tracking our progress and was now coordinating with others of its kind. The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the November cold. We reached our intended campsite just as full darkness began to settle over the forest. It was a small clearing beside a mountain stream, surrounded by towering pines and dense rhododendron thickets. Under normal circumstances, it would have been perfect for our needs, but something felt fundamentally wrong from the moment we arrived. The oppressive silence had intensified, and now it was accompanied by an almost palpable sense of being watched. Both Lena and I found ourselves moving with exaggerated caution, checking and rechecking our surroundings before making any noise. We set up our tents quickly and efficiently, working mostly in whispers. The familiar routine of making camp usually relaxed me, but not tonight. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, and every rustling branch made my heart race. The fog had become so thick that our headlamps could barely penetrate more than a few feet in any direction. As darkness deepened, we built a small fire using fallen branches and prepared our dinner. The flames provided some psychological comfort, creating a tiny circle of warmth and light in the vast darkness of the forest. But even with the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the edge of our vision, studying us. The vocalizations began again around 9 p.m. This time they were much closer, seeming to come from the forest immediately surrounding our campsite. The calls were more complex now, with subtle variations in tone and pitch that suggested a sophisticated communication system. More disturbing still, the calls seemed to be responding to our movements. When one of us would get up to tend the fire or check our gear, the vocalizations would change, becoming more frequent and urgent. It was as if we were being discussed, evaluated, perhaps even described to others we couldn't see. I made the decision to extinguish our fire around 11 p.m. As much as the light comforted us, it also made us visible to whatever was out there. We retreated to our tents, but neither of us slept. We lay in our sleeping bags, fully clothed with our boots on, listening to the sounds that continued throughout the night. The vocalizations grew bolder as the hours passed. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from the trees above us, as if something was moving through the canopy. Other times, they originated from the stream bed or the forest floor nearby. Once, I heard what sounded like heavy footsteps circling our campsite, but when I unzipped my tent to look, I saw nothing but impenetrable fog. Around 3 a.m., something changed. The vocalization stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt oppressive. But this wasn't the natural quiet of a sleeping forest. This was the silence of predators moving into position. I lay in my tent, every muscle tensed, listening for any sound that might indicate what was happening outside. That's when I heard it. The soft whisper of something large moving through the fog with deliberate stealth. The sound was coming from multiple directions, as if we were being surrounded. Through the thin nylon of my tent, I could make out shapes moving in the darkness. Large bipedal forms that seemed to glide through the fog without disturbing the underbrush. They moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, like shadows given substance. One of the shapes paused directly outside my tent. I could see its silhouette through the fabric, enormous and distinctly humanoid but wrong in proportions that my brain struggled to process. It stood there for what felt like hours, so still I began to wonder if I was hallucinating. Then it moved on, and I heard similar shapes positioning themselves around Lena's tent. They were studying us, learning our habits, perhaps planning their next move. The intelligence behind their behavior was undeniable and absolutely terrifying. Dawn came slowly, the fog gradually lightening from black to gray to pale yellow. The shapes had vanished with the darkness, but the evidence of their presence was everywhere. Our campsite was surrounded by the same enormous tracks we'd found earlier, forming concentric circles around our tents. More disturbing still, several of our belongings had been moved during the night. My camera bag, which I'd left beside my tent, was now positioned 10 feet away. Lena's specimen containers had been carefully arranged in a straight line, as if someone had been examining them. Nothing was missing, but everything had been handled. We emerged from our tents exhausted and on edge, but grimly determined to document whatever we were dealing with. As a wildlife photographer, I'd developed a professional detachment that helped me function even in dangerous situations. But this was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. The tracks were clearer now in the morning light, and I was able to get detailed photographs that revealed disturbing details. The prints showed not just toes, but what appeared to be opposable thumbs, suggesting hands rather than feet. The depth and clarity of the impressions indicated incredible weight, probably 800 to 1,000 pounds for each individual. Most unsettling of all, the track pattern showed evidence of complex behavior. The creatures had approached our camp from multiple directions, maintained specific distances from each other, and moved in coordinated patterns that suggested advanced planning and communication. Lena was studying the specimen containers that had been moved during the night. Whatever had handled them had been remarkably gentle, leaving no damage despite the obvious size and strength required to create the tracks we'd found. The precision and care suggested a level of intelligence that challenged everything we thought we knew about forest wildlife. We broke camp quickly, both of us eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever had been watching us through the night. The original plan had been to spend 3 more days in the area, but we both agreed without discussion that we needed to leave as soon as possible. The problem was that we were still 8 miles from the trailhead, and the fog had become so thick that navigation was becoming increasingly difficult. The GPS in our phones was useless under the forest canopy, and the old logging roads we'd been following were becoming harder to distinguish from game trails. We started hiking just after sunrise, maintaining a fast pace that left little energy for conversation. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, but now the silence felt actively menacing rather than simply strange. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, and every sound we made seemed to echo longer than it should. Around 10 a.m. we stopped for a brief rest at what appeared to be an old logging camp. The remnants of rusted equipment and collapsed buildings were barely visible through the fog, giving the place an abandoned, post-apocalyptic feel. That's when I noticed something that made my professional instincts override my fear. The trees around the clearing showed the same systematic bark stripping we'd observed the day before, but on a much larger scale. Dozens of trees had been marked in the same distinctive pattern, creating what looked like a deliberate communication system or territorial boundary. I began photographing the markings, documenting the patterns and measuring the heights of the stripped sections. The work was fascinating from a scientific perspective, but it also confirmed my growing suspicion that we were dealing with something far more sophisticated than any known animal species. That's when Lena made a discovery that changed everything. She was examining the base of one of the marked trees when she found something half buried in the decomposing leaves. It was a piece of fabric, faded and weathered but clearly manufactured. Part of a hiking boot, with a distinctive tread pattern that looked relatively recent. We searched the area more thoroughly and found additional evidence of human presence. Scattered pieces of camping equipment, torn fragments of synthetic clothing, and what appeared to be part of a backpack frame. Everything was damaged and weathered, but the materials suggested these items hadn't been here for more than a few months. The implications were horrifying. Whatever we were dealing with had encountered other humans in this area, and the evidence suggested those encounters hadn't ended well. The systematic nature of the damage, the careful placement of the debris, and the territorial markings all pointed to behavior that was both intelligent and deliberately intimidating. I was photographing the scattered debris when I heard branches breaking in the forest ahead of us. This wasn't the subtle sound of a small animal moving through the underbrush. It was the noise of something large moving through the fog with no regard for stealth. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. About 40 yards away, something enormous emerged from the fog and stepped into the clearing. My camera was already in my hands, and I managed to get several shots before my brain fully processed what I was seeing. It was massive, at least 9 feet tall, and covered in dark, matted hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The creature moved with fluid bipedal grace, its proportions distinctly humanoid but wrong in ways that made my eyes water to look at directly. The face was the worst part. It wasn't quite human, not quite animal, but something in between that shouldn't have been possible. Intelligent eyes set in a bestial face with pronounced brow ridges, and a mouth that seemed designed for purposes I didn't want to contemplate. When it opened its mouth, that same guttural vocalization we'd been hearing echoed through the clearing. But this time, other voices answered from the fog around us. We weren't facing a single creature. We were surrounded by an entire group of them, working together with a level of coordination that spoke to intelligence far beyond what should have been possible. Lena was backing away slowly, her scientific training apparently overridden by pure survival instinct. I continued photographing, my professional detachment warring with the growing realization that we were in mortal danger. The creature in the clearing tilted its head, studying us with obvious intelligence. Then it made a series of complex vocalizations that were clearly directed at the others hidden in the fog. The response was immediate and coordinated, with similar calls coming from multiple directions around us. That's when I understood. We weren't being attacked or even threatened. We were being evaluated, discussed, perhaps even debated among creatures with intelligence approaching our own. The realization was somehow more terrifying than any physical assault would have been. The creature in the clearing took a step toward us, and I heard similar movements in the fog around us. They were closing in, but slowly, deliberately, giving us time to react. This wasn't predatory behavior. It was something else entirely, something that required conscious thought and planning. I grabbed Lena's arm and we began backing away from the clearing, moving slowly to avoid triggering any chase response. The creatures let us go, but I could sense them moving parallel to our route, staying just out of sight in the fog. We were being herded again, guided toward some destination they had chosen. The next few hours were a nightmare of psychological warfare. The creatures never attacked us directly, but they made their presence known through subtle manipulations of our environment. Fallen trees would appear across our path, forcing us to find alternate routes. Rock slides would block promising trails, pushing us toward increasingly remote areas. Their intelligence was undeniable and terrifying. They seemed to anticipate our movements, cutting off escape routes before we even realized they existed. When we tried to backtrack toward the main trail, we would find one of them waiting, forcing us to choose a different path. The fog grew thicker as the day progressed, reducing visibility to mere feet in any direction. We were effectively blind, dependent on the creature's guidance to avoid cliffs and obstacles. The psychological pressure was incredible, like being trapped in a maze where the walls could move and think. Around 2 p.m., we found ourselves in a narrow valley between two steep ridges, with no apparent way forward except through a gap in the rocks ahead. The fog was so thick we couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, and the silence was complete except for our own labored breathing. That's when they revealed themselves. The creatures emerged from the fog simultaneously, surrounding us in a perfect circle. There were at least 6 of them, ranging from the massive individual we'd seen earlier to smaller specimens that were still larger than any human. They stood motionless, studying us with obvious intelligence. Their behavior was not random or instinctual. They were making decisions, communicating with each other through subtle vocalizations and gestures, evaluating the situation with careful consideration. The largest individual, clearly the leader, approached us slowly. Its movements were fluid and deliberate, showing no fear or aggression. It stopped about 10 feet away and began a series of complex vocalizations that were clearly directed at us. The sounds were not random. There was structure, pattern, rhythm that suggested language rather than simple animal communication. The creature was trying to tell us something, though I had no idea what. Lena was sobbing quietly beside me, but I found myself studying the creature with professional fascination. Its behavior was unlike anything I'd ever documented, showing intelligence, curiosity, and what almost seemed like compassion. The leader made another series of vocalizations, this time directed at the others in the circle. Their response was immediate and coordinated, and I realized we were witnessing a complex decision-making process. They were debating what to do with us. The discussion continued for several minutes, with different individuals contributing what appeared to be arguments or opinions. The sounds were hauntingly beautiful in their complexity, like nothing I'd ever heard from any known animal species. Finally, the leader turned back to us and made a single, decisive vocalization. The others responded by stepping back, opening a gap in the circle that pointed toward a narrow trail leading up the ridge. The message was clear. We were free to go, but only in the direction they chose. We didn't hesitate. Lena and I moved quickly toward the opening, expecting at any moment to be grabbed or attacked. But the creatures simply watched us go, their intelligent eyes following our movement with what almost seemed like curiosity. As we climbed the narrow trail, I could hear them moving through the fog behind us, maintaining their distance but clearly following. They weren't pursuing us in any aggressive sense. They were escorting us, ensuring we left their territory through the route they had chosen. The trail was treacherous, winding through loose rock and dense vegetation that would have been impossible to navigate without their guidance. Several times we came to dead ends or dangerous drops, only to find alternative paths that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It took me several hours to realize what was happening. The creatures weren't just escorting us out of their territory. They were actively guiding us to safety, manipulating the environment to ensure we found the right path. Their intelligence was being used to help us rather than harm us. Around 6 p.m., as darkness began to fall, we emerged from the fog onto a familiar logging road. I recognized the area immediately. We were only 2 miles from our car. The creatures had guided us through terrain that would have taken us days to navigate alone, bringing us to safety with remarkable efficiency. We turned to look back at the forest, but the fog had closed in again, concealing whatever might have been watching us from the tree line. The only sound was the wind in the pines and the distant call of a night bird, the first normal forest sound we'd heard in 2 days. The hike back to our car was anticlimactic after everything we'd experienced. We walked in silence, both of us trying to process what had happened. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation, but the evidence was overwhelming. We'd encountered something that challenged every assumption I'd ever made about wildlife intelligence and behavior. The creatures we'd met were not simple animals. They were sentient beings with complex social structures, advanced communication systems, and problem-solving abilities that rivaled our own. The drive back to Hazard was a blur of exhaustion and disbelief. We stopped at the same general store where we'd purchased our supplies, but the elderly proprietor was nowhere to be seen. A younger clerk rang up our purchases without comment, apparently unaware of our harrowing experience. I tried to process the photographs I'd taken, but many of them were blurred or obscured by fog. The few clear images showed humanoid shapes that could have been anything from bears to people in costumes. Without context, they proved nothing. Lena returned to Cincinnati the next morning, and we agreed to keep our experience private until we could figure out what to do with the information. She was convinced we'd discovered a new species, something that could revolutionize our understanding of primate evolution and intelligence. But I was troubled by the implications. If these creatures were real, if they possessed the intelligence and capabilities we'd witnessed, what right did we have to expose them to the modern world? They had shown us compassion when they could have easily harmed us. They deserved the same consideration in return. The weeks that followed were difficult. I tried to return to my normal work, but every assignment in the wilderness reminded me of what we'd encountered. The forests I'd once found peaceful and familiar now seemed to hide secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. I researched everything I could find about similar encounters in the Appalachian region. The reports were scattered and often dismissed as hoaxes, but the patterns were consistent. Intelligent bipedal creatures living in the deepest, most remote areas of the mountains. Encounters that followed similar patterns of evaluation, communication, and careful manipulation of human behavior. Most disturbing were the reports of missing hikers and campers in the same region where we'd had our encounter. The official explanations always involved bears or accidents, but the evidence suggested something far more complex. People who seemed to vanish without a trace, leaving behind only scattered equipment and mysterious footprints. I never filed a formal report about our experience. How could I? Who would believe such a story without concrete proof? And even if I had proof, what would be the consequences for creatures who had shown us nothing but intelligence and compassion? Instead, I've chosen to share our story privately, hoping that others who might encounter these beings will understand what they're dealing with. The creatures of the Appalachian fog are not monsters or threats. They are intelligent beings who deserve our respect and protection, but they are also something far beyond our current understanding of the natural world. They possess capabilities and intelligence that challenge our basic assumptions about consciousness and sentience. They represent a mystery that may be too dangerous for our modern world to handle. 6 months later, I still think about them constantly. I wonder if they remember us, if they've encountered other humans since our meeting, if they're still watching the forests from the fog. I hope they are, and I hope they remain hidden from those who would seek to exploit or harm them. The mountains of eastern Kentucky hold secrets that we're not ready to understand. In the deepest hollers, where the fog never lifts and the silence is complete, something waits that is older and wiser than we can imagine. I was privileged to meet them, and I will carry that knowledge with me for the rest of my life. But I will also carry the responsibility of their protection. Some mysteries are meant to remain hidden, and some creatures are too precious to expose to the harsh light of modern science. The beings in the fog have earned their privacy through millennia of survival in a world that has forgotten how to listen to the wilderness. If you're planning to explore the remote areas of the Appalachian Mountains, please remember that you may not be alone out there. Treat the forest with respect, move quietly, and remember that intelligence takes many forms. The creatures of the fog are not our enemies, but they are not our subjects either. They are fellow inhabitants of a world that grows smaller every day, and they deserve our protection rather than our curiosity. Lena and I never spoke about our experience again, but I know it changed her as much as it changed me. She left her job in Cincinnati and moved to a small town in Vermont, where she now works as a forest ranger. I suspect she's still watching, still listening, still hoping to encounter the beings who showed us such remarkable intelligence and compassion. As for me, I've given up wilderness photography. The forests no longer feel like places of beauty and tranquility. They feel like homes to creatures whose existence depends on our ignorance and restraint. I've become a guardian of secrets I never wanted to learn, a keeper of mysteries that are too dangerous to share. The fog still calls to me sometimes, especially on quiet November mornings when the mist rises from the valleys like smoke from hidden fires. I know that somewhere in those mountains, in the deepest places where human feet rarely tread, something waits with patience and wisdom that spans generations. They are still there, still watching, still protecting their ancient secrets from a world that has forgotten how to wonder without destroying. And perhaps that's exactly how it should be. Naomi Turner is a former wildlife photographer from Lexington, Kentucky. She now works as a park ranger in the Daniel Boone National Forest, where she continues to protect the wilderness and the secrets it holds. Lena Moore declined to be interviewed for this account. On November 15, 2025, Ranger Maya Rodriguez made a discovery that would change everything the world thought it knew about the recent tragedies plaguing the Appalachian Trail. What started as a routine patrol through the Jefferson National Forest became the key to solving a mystery that had claimed multiple lives and left families devastated by unexplained disappearances. Maya had been a park ranger for 12 years, specializing in wilderness search and rescue operations. At 34, she possessed an intimate knowledge of the Appalachian wilderness that few could match. Her expertise in tracking, combined with her background in wildlife biology, made her the perfect person to investigate the strange occurrences that had been terrorizing hikers throughout 2025. The morning began like any other autumn day in the mountains. The crisp November air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke from the small mountain communities that dotted the landscape. Maya had volunteered for an extended solo patrol through the most remote sections of the forest, areas that had been closed to the public following the recent incidents involving missing hikers and unexplained attacks. Her mission was straightforward: conduct a comprehensive survey of the closed trail sections, document any unusual signs or disturbances, and assess whether the areas could safely be reopened to the public. The Park Service had been under increasing pressure from local communities whose economies depended heavily on hiking tourism, but safety remained the top priority. Maya's first stop was the site where Devin Matthews had vanished 8 months earlier, after his companions Jake Rodriguez and Marcus Thompson had been found dead at their destroyed campsite. The official investigation had concluded that the deaths were caused by a large predator, possibly a bear with abnormal, aggressive behavior. However, Maya had always harbored doubts about this explanation. As she approached the infamous campsite, Maya noticed something that previous investigators had missed. The damage patterns to the surrounding trees were too systematic, too purposeful to be the work of a wild animal acting on instinct. The claw marks extended far higher than any known bear species could reach, and they appeared to follow a deliberate pattern that suggested intelligence rather than random destruction. More intriguingly, Maya discovered that the enormous footprints found at the scene displayed subtle variations that indicated not one creature, but multiple individuals. Her trained eye could distinguish at least 3 distinct sets of tracks, each with unique characteristics that suggested a family group or small community of whatever had been responsible for the attacks. Maya spent the morning documenting her findings, taking detailed measurements and photographs that would later prove crucial to understanding the true nature of the threat. As she worked, she became increasingly convinced that the creatures responsible for the attacks were not mindless monsters, but intelligent beings with complex social structures and behaviors. The breakthrough came when Maya discovered something that had been overlooked by every previous investigation: a series of carefully constructed shelters hidden deep in the forest canopy. These structures were woven from branches and leaves with a sophistication that spoke to advanced problem-solving abilities and tool use. The shelters were positioned strategically to provide excellent vantage points over the hiking trails, while remaining completely invisible to ground-based observers. Inside one of the larger shelters, Maya found evidence that changed everything: carefully preserved food stores, primitive tools made from shaped stone and bone, and, most remarkably, what appeared to be a crude form of artwork depicting human figures in forest scenes. These discoveries suggested that the creatures were not just intelligent predators, but a previously unknown species with their own culture and social organization. As Maya continued her investigation, she began to piece together a different narrative than the one presented in the official reports. The creatures had not been randomly attacking hikers out of malice or hunger. They had been defending their territory from what they perceived as an increasing invasion of their habitat. The systematic nature of their actions suggested they were trying to drive humans away from their nesting areas and food sources. The most significant discovery came when Maya found a hidden cave system that appeared to serve as the creature's primary dwelling. The caves were extensive, with multiple chambers that showed evidence of long-term habitation. Most importantly, one of the deeper chambers contained clear signs of recent human presence: torn clothing, hiking equipment, and personal items that belonged to several of the missing hikers. Maya's heart raced as she realized that some of the missing hikers might still be alive. The creatures had not been killing everyone they encountered, but rather capturing some individuals and keeping them in these underground chambers. The purpose remained unclear, but the evidence suggested the possibility of rescue rather than recovery. Working carefully to avoid detection, Maya began mapping the cave system and documenting the evidence of human captivity. She discovered that the creatures had been providing their captives with food and water, suggesting they intended to keep them alive for extended periods. The motivation for this behavior remained mysterious, but it offered hope for the families of the missing hikers. Over the following weeks, Maya developed a comprehensive understanding of the creatures' behavior patterns and social structure. She observed them from hidden positions, learning their daily routines and communication methods. The creatures displayed remarkable intelligence, using complex vocalizations and body language to coordinate their activities. They showed clear family bonds and social hierarchies that indicated a sophisticated society. Maya's most crucial observation was that the creatures were not inherently hostile to humans. Their aggressive behavior appeared to be a defensive response to perceived threats to their territory and offspring. The attacks on hikers had escalated as human activity in their habitat increased, creating a cycle of conflict that neither species understood how to resolve. Working with wildlife behaviorists and anthropologists, Maya developed a communication protocol based on the creature's observed behavioral patterns. The plan was risky but necessary. She would attempt to make peaceful contact with the creatures and negotiate the release of any surviving captives while establishing boundaries that would prevent future conflicts. The first contact attempt took place on a cold December morning. Maya approached one of the creature's known gathering areas, moving slowly and deliberately while using the non-threatening postures she had observed in their social interactions. She carried gifts of food and simple tools, hoping to demonstrate peaceful intentions. The initial encounter was tense and frightening. 3 of the creatures emerged from the forest, their massive forms initially appearing menacing despite Maya's preparation. However, as she maintained her calm demeanor and continued using their observed communication signals, the creature's posture gradually shifted from aggressive to curious. The breakthrough came when Maya played recordings of the creature's own vocalizations, modified to include submissive tones that indicated her desire for peaceful interaction. The creatures responded with similar calls, and for the first time in recorded history, humans and these unknown beings were communicating. The negotiation process took weeks of careful, gradual contact. Maya learned that the creatures called themselves something that roughly translated to forest guardians in their complex system of sounds and gestures. They had been living in the Appalachian Mountains for generations, maintaining a careful balance with the natural environment while avoiding contact with human settlements. The recent conflicts had begun when increased hiking activity and climate change had disrupted their traditional territories, forcing them into closer contact with human visitors. The creatures had initially tried to discourage human presence through intimidation. But as the encounters escalated, some individuals had begun capturing rather than killing hikers, hoping to understand the newcomers and find a way to coexist. Maya's most emotional moment came when she was finally led to the cave chambers where the missing hikers were being held. She found 4 survivors, including Devin Matthews, who had been captured rather than killed during the March incident. The captives were weak and traumatized but alive, having been sustained by the creature's care during their months of captivity. The rescue operation required careful coordination between Maya and the forest guardians. The creatures had developed protective attachments to some of their captives, particularly those who had shown them kindness and understanding during their captivity. Devin had actually learned to communicate with his captors and had become an informal ambassador between the 2 species. The final resolution came through a historic agreement negotiated by Maya and the Forest Guardians' leadership. Large sections of the most remote wilderness areas would be designated as protected habitat, off-limits to human activity. In exchange, the creatures would withdraw from areas of high human traffic and release all remaining captives. The agreement included provisions for ongoing communication between the species, with Maya serving as the primary liaison. The creatures would provide early warning of any dangerous conditions in the wilderness, while humans would respect their territorial boundaries and minimize environmental disruption in their habitat areas. When the missing hikers were finally returned to their families, the emotional reunions were covered by media worldwide. Devin Matthews, Sarah from Kelly's account, and 2 other survivors who had been presumed dead were alive and relatively healthy, though deeply affected by their extraordinary experience. The survivors' accounts painted a complex picture of their captors. While the initial capture had been terrifying, the creatures had shown them unexpected kindness and protection. Some captives had developed genuine bonds with individual forest guardians, particularly the younger ones who showed curiosity about human behavior and culture. Maya's discovery led to a revolutionary shift in how the scientific community approached cryptozoology and wilderness conservation. The forest guardians were officially recognized as a new species, and their intelligence and social complexity made them subjects of intense but respectful study. The Appalachian Trail was gradually reopened with new safety protocols and educational programs that taught hikers about the forest guardians and the importance of respecting their territory. The incidents that had once terrorized the hiking community became the foundation for an unprecedented example of interspecies cooperation and understanding. Maya continued her work as a liaison between humans and the forest guardians, helping to establish research programs that studied their culture and behavior while ensuring their privacy and protection. The creatures proved to be valuable partners in wilderness conservation, their intimate knowledge of the forest ecosystem contributing to more effective environmental protection strategies. The families of the attack victims found peace in knowing that their loved ones' experiences had led to this historic breakthrough. The deaths were not meaningless tragedies, but catalysts for a new understanding between species that had shared the same habitat for generations without knowing of each other's existence. Years later, Maya would reflect on how the events of 2025 had transformed not just the Appalachian wilderness, but humanity's understanding of its place in the natural world. The forest guardians had taught them that intelligence and society could take forms beyond human imagination, and that cooperation was possible even between species that had initially seen each other as threats. The Appalachian Mountains became a symbol of hope for conservation efforts worldwide, proving that even the most complex environmental conflicts could be resolved through patience, understanding, and respect for all forms of life. Maya's courage in reaching out to the unknown had opened a door to a future where humans and their mysterious forest neighbors could coexist in harmony. The story of the forest guardians spread throughout the world, inspiring new approaches to wildlife conservation and reminding humanity that the natural world still held mysteries waiting to be discovered and understood. Maya's legacy would endure as proof that sometimes the most frightening encounters can lead to the most profound discoveries about the nature of life itself. In the end, the Appalachian Trail tragedy became the Appalachian miracle, a testament to the power of courage, understanding, and the possibility of peace between all Earth's inhabitants. The mountains themselves seem to approve of the resolution, their ancient peaks standing as silent witnesses to the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between humanity and the wild places of the world.